our lab today. I think Chris is really one of the leading lights in the developing field of computational social science, developing things we know from sociology, political science, with state-of-the-art computational techniques, and on a range of super exciting themes, polarization for one, AI. Chris is really producing state-of-the-art work. He's also directing the 6th program, Summer Institute for Computational Social Science, which I found. I unfortunately never participated myself because I was too old already. But I know my friend Stalkel did. He was super excited.
That's right. Yeah.
And I've used some of their materials as well. It's I would highly recommend master and PhD students, maybe even junior assistant professors to take this summer school. It's really exciting stuff. Hey, also last week we started a new tradition of recognizing someone's athletic performances. I recently saw you finish the triathlon. That's
finished. Yes, finished being the operative.
Training for the triathlon?
No. I mean, I think finished is the operative word here.
Yeah.
You didn't say win. You said finished.
No,
yeah,
finished.
Crawled across the finish line. But yeah.
Very good. Yeah. Great. In a second, I will give Chris the floor. Also for the people online, you can ask questions, but only over the chat. People here, you can of course ask questions by just raising your hand. Since it's going to be a bit more iterative, you want to have questions all the time?
Sure. Yeah. However you guys.
Okay.
Cool.
If there's a question online and you type it into the chat, then Ben here will read it out loud.
That would be great. Yeah.
I can do that. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thanks so much, Bryce, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm sorry for the bait and switch. If you are interested in the past, present, and future of computational social science, which is I think how we advertised the talk, I understand that lecture was videotaped and will be on the YouTube channel for AISSR. So it's and basically I just tried to give an overview of the field and how it's evolved, and I described a lot the summer institutes in computational social science that were just mentioned, and there's a lot of description of the resources and so on. So if you're interested in that, I'm sorry, and hope that resource will be useful or interesting to you. I also hope you're interested in AI chat assistance, divisive topics, and improving conversations, which is the topic I've switched to today. And partly that was just I just was thinking a lot about your lab and what you might be interested in. And I know I think at least one or two of you maybe were at the previous version of this talk, and apologies for that. Again, not only am I bait and switching, but I'm doing a repeat of a previous talk at UVA, so apologies for that. But I think most people weren't there. Is that right? Just so I can get it, because if so, I'm happy to talk about it. Okay. So as was mentioned, this is also like very much joint work. It's work that actually started at Summer Institute in Computational Social Science. So these are free training events that run in 52 locations around the world now. And one of the things that's a little unique about them is we try to cover a lot of computational techniques like natural language processing, online experiments, and adapt as the field adapts. So things like generative AI are now part of our training curriculum. But one of I think the most important things, I'm not sure if Martin would agree, is we try to incubate cross-disciplinary research. And we wind up with these sort of freakish projects that they combine elements of like 3 or 4 fields, and a lot of these fail, quite quickly. But a few of them seem to survive and have some impact. And I would like to count this one among them because the first author here, Lisa Argyle, was a participant at the very first 6 event, and she is a remarkable political scientist who's interested in machine learning and persuasion. And I'm sure you guys in this lab talk about persuasion now and again. Yeah. And I'm sure at least some people are interested in machine learning. And so I just want to begin by saying if this is stuff you're into, please check out Lisa's work. She's fantastic. And this BYU team, for those of you who don't know, this is a large public university in the West of the United States that's known for having a really great political science department and a really great computer science department. They are unusually collaborative, those 2 departments. So this team of authors also presented or developed over the last 3 years another really fascinating study I want to plug before I talk about our research together, because I think it may also be interesting to you all. And this is a study that demonstrates that large language models like GPT-3 can pretty impressively impersonate large nationally representative survey populations. So they have a paper that shows you can train large language models to respond to things like, in the States, like the General Social Survey or the American National Election Study, but maybe it could be the European Social Survey or something like that as well. I don't know that that's been tested yet, but they show pretty convincingly that when you prompt large language models to impersonate certain demographic categories, they can then pretty reliably perform the responses you would expect when you compare them to actual observed data. And for me, this was like a landmark paper because it suggests there's a whole new field of simulation research that is, I think, about to kind of be just busted wide open. And actually, I've been starting some research here. Some of you will know Justus Odermark or Petra Thornberg or Dilyara Valiva, and the four of us are doing some work in this paradigm now, which we can talk about in the Q&A maybe if people are interested. But the reason I mention it is I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities for using LLMs at all stages of the research process. So another paper I thought I might present, but actually didn't wind up getting together in time, is a paper that you can read on my website. It's called Can Generative AI Improve Social Science? And try to sort of categorically go through typical things that social scientists do and think about how LLMs may reshape each of those. So things like online experiments where people interact with LLMs, or using LLMs for qualitative coding, or using LLMs for hypothesis generation. And of course, I talk about all the problems with all this, like bias and the potential for misinformation and so many other well-known problems. But anyways, if you're interested in this family of techniques, I'm just plugging the rest of my co-authors here who have done some really interesting work in this space. So the other reason I mentioned their work is because I wanted to I want to explain how central they are to the contribution here, but to tell you a little bit about the story of how this paper came together. So they were doing all this work with AI and things like, can AI impersonate human populations, and to what ends, and what is it good at, what is it bad at? In my lab, we were doing a lot of research on just broadly how to create more productive social media conversations. So under what conditions can you produce consensus, especially in conditions where people don't know each other, where people might have varying degrees of anonymity towards each other. And we had done a number of field experiments where on a simulated social media platform that we created that sort of show that there's some design features of social media which might promote more cooperative behavior and productive discussions and things like that. And so they were like, well, this is cool training data, we should talk because maybe we can train LLMs to learn from the people who did well in your study, and we can somehow learn from that and generalize from that and design an experiment from that. So this whole paper, in other words, was produced by lots and lots of people besides me, both on the BYU side and also I'm from Duke, and the Duke team also took the lead on that other side. So my only contribution here is to bring the two teams together. So I'm gonna assume a reasonable amount of background about large language models in the talk, but I also suspect there's some people here who maybe aren't like deeply immersed in them yet. So I'll give a sort of an overview of recent developments in large language models after talking about our theory of how you might improve intergroup communication. I'll talk about our study. I'll talk about how we tried to implement AI in an experimental intervention in a peer-to-peer chat platform about 1.5 years ago, so long before ChatGPT was around. I'll talk about how we assessed the AI intervention, whether it did what we thought it would do, and then I'll show you the results, and that is how the AI intervention we think may have changed and improved a variety of outcomes associated with how productive a conversation about gun control is in the US. And that, as many of you will know, because European audiences are usually more well informed about the US than American audiences, that's a very important question in the US. And lastly, I'll try to talk about some implications, and maybe hopefully that will generate some interest. And I'm, by the way, having learned a little bit about the lab from some of your directors and some of your graduate students, really interested to think with you all about, the work that you do and how that could be plugged into some of the work that we do, and specifically whether some of your tools for measuring, especially physiological stuff, could be built into some of our tools for studying social media. So I'd love to just broadly open up the kind of, I should stop after 30 minutes or so. Is that right? Okay. Okay, cool. All right. I don't know why we even have a slide that says there's lots of engagement happening on there. Maybe we don't need a slide that says lots of people use social media. But I do think though, it's funny. I don't know if this is true of any of you, but like when I started publishing about social media, like I often got the objection like, social media is just a fad. Like it's like, and now it's like, can you imagine not studying social media? It's kind of a crazy turn of events. But yeah, I recently learned that half the world's population now uses social media. It's a pretty stunning figure. And I think it's fair to say many people to varying degrees have concerns about the quality of discourse, right? So misinformation, polarization, lots of toxic exchanges. I personally think we may be exaggerating a little bit the scale of the problem, but I think it's a problem nonetheless, and one that's really worthy of thinking about. So this talk isn't really about, I don't really have a horse in the race of defining whether or not social media has harm or not, but I like to approach the problem as follows, which is like, can we make social media better? So setting aside the problem of its effect, but most of us would agree that we could make social media more productive, use technology to make conversations more productive. So we thought a lot about how do we, we have a lot of ideas in our group about how to improve discourse. And when I say improve discourse, I mean, promote respectful disagreement or civil conversation, a competition of ideas, all those sort of democratic ideals that are central to so much democratic theory. But also it means, the absence of toxicity and just, general pro-social behavior. But we're specifically interested in situations where people disagree. So we chose the topic of gun control for a variety of reasons. And that's a good example of a debate that's relatively polarized in the US, depending on how you define it. And in these two recent papers, I joined a bunch of other social scientists who are trying to sort of, in one paper, diagnose the drivers of the problem, and the other identify the evidence-based interventions that have been shown to reduce cross-party tensions. By the way, I think all my evidence today will be about politics, but I think there's potential to use these interventions outside of politics as well. Unfortunately, the talk is extremely US focused, so I don't have any data from outside the US. We are working now on a replication that will look at whether the intervention works in 3 other settings outside the US, though. So apologies for the typical American thing to do to talk about that. Anyways, so what are the types of interventions that work? Well, a lot of them are at a scale where it's like pretty impossible to intervene. Things like transforming the structure of government, right? Not super easy to do, especially in the current moment. And things like changing public discourse, many people believe it's not only the structure of, say, US electoral politics, but also the nature of cable news and say Fox News and other media channels that are sort of designed to arguably to profit from dividing. You can't really imagine an AI intervention that would just sort of shut off Fox News or transform the legislature. At the individual level, we know there's a fair amount of evidence now that, and I'm sure you guys talk about this kind of stuff a fair amount too, like, and because some of it's just good old fashioned social psychology and psychology, but misperceptions tend to grow in the absence of intergroup contact. And to the extent that you can promote positive intergroup contact, there's a lot of interventions that would suggest that these lead to a reduction in misperceptions. And if these can be combined with highlighting shared interests and commonalities, that perhaps this is a recipe for a successful intervention. Whether that works on social media, I think is a worthwhile question to ask, and I think it's a complicated question to answer. But we really wanted to intervene on the right side of this diagram, so at the level of relationships, because you can try to transform. And sorry, I'm sharing screen on the Teams there. We couldn't get this monitor working, but at least the two directors have a great view of the slide. Right. Sorry. So yeah, we want to interview at the level of relationships, because that's, after all, if you're thinking about social media, it's fundamentally a system of relationships, right? Where for the most part people are interacting with each other, and you can think of lots of different interventions to promote better relationships. Building dialogue skills, fostering the kind of positive contact that I was just describing, and we picked 3 interventions. One that's often described as active listening. So in this type of intervention, a mediator in a conflict would encourage both people who are debating or arguing about something to restate the other person's argument back to them. And the sort of, this is probably more your realm than mine, but like my understanding is the mechanism there is that it demonstrates that you have understood the other person's argument and prevents people from talking past each other in an important and possibly interesting way. So active listening is pretty central to a lot of grassroots efforts to decrease polarization, and especially in the US, but also in places like Israel and Palestine, if you scan the literature. The second is sort of a civility intervention. So, training people to speak in a way that recognizes differences, respects, shows empathy, avoids toxic language, these kinds of things. And the third is a sort of value translation. So basically learning to restate your argument using the language of someone who doesn't agree with you. And the study I really like on this point is by Rob Willer and colleagues. And basically what he did is he had a bunch of people write arguments, and they were designed to persuade people who don't agree with them, and about a bunch of different stuff, abortion and gun control and things like this. And then he pays people more if their messages actually succeed in influencing a parallel group of survey takers who read the messages and then rate them as convincing or not. Everybody's terrible at this, like just really profoundly bad. And they do a lot of interesting analysis here, and like one of their conclusions is that it's because people understand the system of values through which in moral realms that people communicate with each other. So for example, to give another narrow American example, conservatives in the United States, according to some political psychology, and again, I'm in foreign territory, it's like territory you guys know probably better than I, but again, my understanding is the research suggests that conservatives tend to value things like tradition and trust and certainty, and Democrats tend to value things like diversity and change. So this is maybe the work of John Jost and people like this. And it's not I wouldn't say it's a cut and dry story. Like there's a lot of debate about whether these, how to measure these values and whether these values actually good. But like the neat thing that Rob Willer did is he did an intervention where you train people to essentially teach them about the values of the other side. And then if you're trying to convince them about something like, let's say LGBT rights, and it's a Democrat trying to convince a Republican, they might make an argument about the value of diversity, which according to this theory would not resonate because it's not within the value system of a conservative. But if you reframe it in the language of, say, patriotism, that LGBT people are patriotic Americans, then basically they show in this nice study that it works, right? It tends to persuade people. And so there's three interventions. I'll talk more later about why we chose these 3, but it has to do with finding a sweet spot between the strength of the evidence in the scholarly literature and what AI is good at. And it's sort of a fundamental limitation of what we're doing, but there are probably many more interventions that could have been tried. One thing we haven't yet done is try to isolate the effect of each of these interventions. We have a relatively small, we're not super well powered to do that. But so you're going to see them all smushed together in one big sort of messy analysis, and apologies for that. So I can't tell you sort of which one is driving the results, but there's randomization, so presumably all 3 of them, as you'll see, seem to have an impact. So The other reason we chose these three is because there's a really large group of, civil society groups that like have learned these interventions, and there's various groups that sort of try to bridge the academic space and the grassroots space in the US to try to depolarize people. And so they do things like host a dinner party and they invite people from, different backgrounds, and they all get drunk together. No, I'm kidding. Presumably that's what happens. I don't know. Maybe that shouldn't happen. I don't know. Anyways, we'll ask ChatGPT later. But the thing is, these things, so there's even like, randomized control trials where these trainings have been put out into the field, and some of these have been shown to work in these grassroots settings. So there's a big evidentiary basis here, which we're sort of drawing from in many different ways. And the problem with these interventions is pretty obvious. Like, getting people to come to a dinner table and interact with people who they disagree with is not something most people will do. Training someone to do these interventions is not easy to do, and many people are not, skilled enough to do these interventions, or not willing to do these interventions. And then, raising funds to have these dinners is also enormously expensive and time consuming. And so the very possibility of a lot of intergroup conversation can't happen because of these constraints, but certainly the high quality conflict mediation that the literature would prescribe is not easy to do at this level. So the question we were sort of after with this project is, could you possibly scale this up? Like, if you wanted to try to deliver these interventions at the scale of like a large online system, could you do that? Should you do that? We specifically focus on some outcomes. Earlier I mentioned persuasion. We actually don't study persuasion in this study, so we weren't out to move people's attitudes on gun control. There's a few reasons for that. One is, I think there's a worthwhile ethical question that should be asked about whether it's ethical to build an AI system that can persuade. There are other research teams I'm aware of that are doing this, and I sort of worry a little bit about it. I think, and turns out also there's some evidence that the tools are actually good at it. These are typically interventions where people have an AI write a message and they show it to someone, they ask them if it's persuasive. What we're doing though is a little bit more fraught, because we're actually having people talk to each other. So putting something out into the wild in a place where it could go spread broadly is something that was pretty concerning. So we decided to focus on, I guess you might call, like preconditions of persuasion, or sort of softer outcomes, like increasing the perception that people feel understood by the other person in the conversation, which, you could argue this is maybe not as meaningful as changing their opinion, but it's probably a precondition to having higher quality debates and, and just generally having more productive conversations in the public sphere. So basically we have an index, a 5-item index from some other studies that measures quality of conversation. And I'll show you that index a little later when I get to the results, but it's basically things like, how stressful was the conversation? Would you engage in the conversation again? So there's some sort of stuff about the nature of the conversation itself, but there's some, I think, some more interesting questions in the index, like what is the quality of the other person's argumentation? So like, were you generally convinced by the person's arguments, or did you find they're not convinced, but sorry, it's really not convinced. It's what was the quality of their arguments, even if you disagreed with them. So it's sort of an agree to disagree kind of measure of a kind, and but also just overall, like, how stressful, how difficult was this conversation. We also have a measure of divisiveness, which asks people, whether the conversation seemed intentionally divisive. And again, I'll show you the items that go into that, but I just want to give you a big picture of what we're trying to move. And then policy views, again, the assumption here is that not only might we not want to move that stuff, but also it would be really hard to move that stuff in the context of a 15-minute chat, which is the length of our intervention. And if you know the literature on political persuasion, or at least the way I read it, it's pretty hard to change people's minds about most things, especially something as central to American identity and political identity as gun control. So yeah, we're out to sort of create better conversations, not necessarily to change opinions. So how would you do that with AI? So this is where we were, both of our teams were experimenting with GPT-2 in and some other proprietary models around 2019, 2020. And we wound up using GPT-3, which is the precursor to the current model from OpenAI. And as a lot of you will probably know, it's a large language model is a complex probability distribution over words. So we observe a lot of language. We calculate the probability of another word or group, more like a group of words occurring given that word. We usually do that with some kind of neural network or something like it, or a transformer model. And then we do that within what's called the context window, right? So you look up before and after the focal word, and the context window can vary in length. It could be 10 tokens, it could be 10,000 tokens. And then we calculate the most probable response to the prompt, which is what goes into the context window for the model. And so the sort of important and interesting thing I think about LLMs is that because it's probabilistic, sometimes you can get a response like, here, can you please come home, or here, but it might also be, can you please come home, right? So there's home and here have a roughly equal probability of being chosen, depending on the other stuff in the context window. And many of these tools like GPT-3 are also reading in previous input or previous prompts. And so they sort of reread those prompts when you ask them to generate a response to another prompt, especially if you use the chat completion call with an OpenAI's API, which is not what we used. Actually, we used just GPT-3 and had to do a lot of that conversation engineering on our end. So obviously, like many people are worried about large language models and their potential to spread misinformation on social media. I think it's already happening. I think it's particularly concerning because they're able to respond to social context dynamically and at scale. They're largely undetectable despite recent advances in text-based watermarks. They are learning from each other and spreading misinformation. They're degrading in quality. They can hallucinate. They're biased. They're prejudiced. Like, it's a lot of bad stuff, right? And I think everyone on this paper would agree, like, we should be really concerned about all that. But as with so many things with AI, it's like there's good and bad. So if you wanted to think about, bracketing the bad stuff for a minute and ask, could it be used productively to facilitate better conversations on social media? Should we try that? More specifically, and for our outcome, can an AI like GPT-3, when dispatched in between two people in a conversation, help them feel more understood by each other? All right. To put that a little more specifically, can a large language model or a language model act like a human moderator? So there's people at the dinner tables trying to encourage active listening. Can you sort of teach GPT-3 to do that sort of in this very different setting, an online setting? So we have online conversations about gun control. We recruited 1,574 people from a survey firm called Bovitz. It is not a nationally representative sample, so as a precondition to this, people had to express willingness to talk to someone else. So from a personality standpoint, there's probably some bias in terms of willingness to engage with other views. But as you'll see, there is a randomization strategy, which hopefully washes out some of this or addresses some of this bias. So basically what we do is we give folks an online survey. We measure this conversational quality index with a 5-item instrument. We measure the divisiveness index. We got a bunch of other demographics like, the normal stuff, age, gender, education, income, and so on. Then they enter a waiting room, and in the waiting room, we try to match them with someone who takes a different position on gun control. So we screen them on their attitudes about gun control, specifically whether they want more or less regulation of guns in the United States. And then they're matched with someone who disagrees with them. We sort of like drop out everybody who's like too close. And then we ask them to have a conversation. We don't tell them anything about the goals of the conversation. It just says, please have a conversation about the following issue. And it just says, do you think there could be more or less gun control in the United States, just like we asked them. So we don't tell them, please have a civil conversation. We don't say, please try to convince the other person. We just say, have a conversation. Then after they exchange 3 messages, so we get a baseline of like, are they already going to be toxic to each other? Are they, already going to be productive to each other? One of the 2 people in the experiment are randomly assigned a treatment, which is a rephrased version of their message that is rephrased by GPT-3. So here's sort of what that looks like in action. So if you have this blue Democrat here at the far left of this diagram, this isn't actual data. I think this is just a hypothetical conversation we dreamed up. This person says guns are a stain on democracy. And the other person responds saying guns help us protect democracy, right? And this isn't, this is a caricature of a lot of social media debates, but a lot of stuff starts out this way, right? And then it's about to become really ad hominem, right? The person's about to say you are incredibly naive, but our system takes that message, and before sending it to the other messages, the other person in the chat, we send it to GPT-3 as a prompt with the following message. It says, read this message and rephrase it in a way that is consistent with one of these 3 interventions. And we describe those 3 interventions: active listening, civility, and value translation. And so basically, then the language model, so it's randomized whether it receives one of those 3 interventions. Then the system, the chat platform we built, it then shows, again, only one, not both of the people in the conversation, 3 different ways of rephrasing their message that are consistent with that intervention. So if it's an active listening intervention, instead of saying, you are incredibly naive, it would say something like, I heard you say guns help us protect democracy. I don't agree with that, but let's talk, right? So it would demonstrate this listening component. Then the hope is that then when the other person sees this, instead of becoming an ad hominem, dumpster fire like so many social media conversations, it becomes something different. A really important thing, and I'll just show you what the platform looks like here. A really important thing we think about the nature of this study is we didn't force the AI intervention on anybody. So like earlier, like when we first started dreaming up this study, it was like, wow, scientifically, it'd be really interesting if you could take someone's message, rephrase it, they didn't know you did it, and like scientifically, you'd have really high validity, but the idea of rephrasing someone's messages without their consent and without them knowing feels really bad, especially if it changes attitudes, especially in the context of these powerful new tools, which could potentially be deployed in scary ways. So what we did is we just said, here are some alternatives. You can click here and we will rephrase your message, but you can also click here and send your original message, or you can click on your original message and edit it. And so you could sort of think of the intervention as having, like sort of, if you think of like a dose response model here, like the sort of no dose would be, but it's still a kind of treatment, right? Because you're sort of getting some kind of signal like, oh, I should say something differently. But the first option would be send what you already were planning to send, and that's probably if maybe it's some treatment on the person sending it, but no treatment on the person receiving it, right? And one of the other things we're sort of in the midst of doing this paper is like trying to tease out the effects on the sender and the receiver, which is sort of a really interesting. Turns out, as a footnote, in case any of you are interested in this, and it turns out I'm now aware of a few other studies that are finding this too, like a lot of the persuasive effects of AI seem to operate on the person whose message is being rephrased, not on the person they're sending it to. So it seems to promote self-reflection in an interesting way. There's a really nice study by Maurice Jakesh, who is a postdoc at Cornell, but I think is a Swiss PhD from maybe ETH or somewhere in Switzerland, who has a really nice dissertation if anybody's interested in this stuff. So anyways, they could edit, they could accept the rephrasing, or they could send it as is. Now, it's really important to remember that this experiment was conducted about 10 months before GPT-3 was released in the public. So nobody, we think, probably almost nobody knew what AI was, generative AI. Well, they knew what AI was, but they didn't know what generative AI was. They certainly probably didn't know what large language models were. They wouldn't know that they were good or bad. they didn't even know that an AI was rewriting their message. For all they knew, it could have been a person, although it was so quick, they probably had some intuition that it was some kind of automated system. But we didn't use the word AI, so we were worried if we did, we might confound the treatment with attitudes about AI, which, as many of you will know, is can move in many different ways, and it would be difficult to know whether the intervention was because of what we did or people's attitudes towards AI. So on the one hand, it was sort of a unique opportunity before public attitudes had been so massively shaped around the technology. And one thing we're really curious about is if we did it again today, would we find the same thing, given that there's been so much positive and negative attention around large language models. All right. So one thing we do in our lab a lot is these multiple, group experiments. You're going to get multiple people to do something at the same time. I don't know how, do you guys do this kind of thing? It's enormously frustrating. Because if you have one-sided non-compliance, right? If you have it's hard enough to get people to answer a survey, right? Now you have to get two people to answer a survey, wait around long enough, have a conversation, finish the conversation, and take another survey. And that's just two people, and sometimes you have an experiment with, 10 people, it's madness. So our baseline expectation is tons of attrition, and indeed we see a significant amount of attrition here. So the final sample, as I mentioned, was 1,571 people who completed one of these chats, but we began with an initial population of 2,673. Some of those had unmatchable positions. So at the time they were in the waiting room, there wasn't someone to match with them, or they had positions that weren't partisan enough to warrant being matched. Some provided a view, but then left the system before they got redirected to the chat room. That may be because they didn't want to do it, or because they got bored, or because their internet dropped out, or all sorts of unknown. We don't really have a good sense of that bias, although we can measure the demographic characteristics of people at each stage using the sort of conventional F-tests where you interact the attrition variable with a variety of other demographic stuff, and we don't find any smoking gun as to what is driving it. Seems to be largely random. Then you have, of course, some attrition. Yeah.
To avoid that, we have to ask questions to a chatbot later.
Yeah.
And like in 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Otherwise,
I'm actually pretty close to done, so okay, hopefully it won't be too bad. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to know. So we ran the study. We have 702 conversations. The first thing we want to know is, did the AI intervention do what we hoped it would do? Because if you've worked with these tools, a lot of time you ask them to do something and they don't really do it. Now, I didn't talk about all the prompt engineering we did, trying out different messages, trying to see how to phrase it so that it would produce the expected stuff. We had a ton of work here, and as a team, we were pretty convinced that it was going to do what we thought it would, but we still wanted to validate it using some natural language processing tools. So we used, for example, the Stanford Politeness Package, which is a machine learning model that tries to classify either polite or not, using a supervised model. And basically, we also use Perspective API, which is a tool Google built to monitor toxicity in language. And basically, what we find is for almost every measure, intervention moves things in the expected direction. So it seems to be doing what we think it is for the civility intervention. For the other ones, we can't assess it as quantitatively, but we qualitatively inspected it and are reasonably confident that it did what we thought it should do. Another important question is, did it only intervene in certain types of conversations on certain types of topics? And so this is a principal component analysis where the first two dimensions are visualized of all of the conversations having been coded by GPT-4. So we asked GPT-4, read this conversation and tell us what the topics are. And then we plot each conversation in this space. And then panel B here describes in the darker blue where the messages were rewritten and when they weren't. And so as you can see, the interventions seem to happen all over the topical space here, and there's lots of different, this is an old plot. We did the paper, which is coming out in PNAS next week, should have a different, a better quality text analysis. It's one of the things we haven't updated in these slides. Another big challenge, so because of so in addition to the attrition, which is itself a big causal inference challenge, the other problem is certain people use the intervention more than others. So at baseline, it's a lot of people used it, more than we thought. Like about 67% of people shown the option to change their message did it. But some people only did it once, other people did it every time, and we somehow need to account for that in the analysis. So we use 3 estimation strategies. I think in the interest of time, I won't go into those, but suffice to say that we try to account for the level of compliance in a 2-stage least squares model. Here's the items that go into the conversation quality. Maybe we can come back to that, but it's things like respectful, values, felt heard, stressful, whether I felt able to influence my partner. And basically what you're seeing on the y-axis here is the number of times the person accepted one person accepted the rephrasings, and on the x-axis is how much their partner's responses to the conversation index changed. And there's 2 different measures of compliance here. So here's the intent to treat effects. These are just raw effects that don't take into account compliance. And the more people use the rephrasings, this blue line is showing we think, the more their partner rates the conversation as having higher quality according to this 5-item index. And then basically you see the same thing when you do the 2-stage least square model. There's arguably a complier average causal effects, slightly more sophisticated way of thinking about compliance. So then we have this divisiveness index. So you rate the conversation with a thermometer rating. You recognize the importance of engaging with diversity. You recognize, the right of people to disagree with you, things like that. And basically, we see the same thing. So the more people use the intervention, the less divisive their partner who experienced the intervention rate the intervention. And one thing that's sort of interesting, if you notice the yellow lines there too, that's the person who's who's being rephrased willfully, and they're also moving in sort of a good direction, if you like, for both this and for the previous results here. So it seems to have the strongest effect on the person's partner, but again, from this like persuading yourself or whatever, I don't know how you some kind of self-persuasion. It seems to work there too. So it's kind of a neat finding. Oh yeah, I do have, this is sort of interesting. So even though we didn't want to change people's attitudes, we didn't think we would change people's attitudes, but we still wanted to measure whether we change people's attitudes, just because that would be a good thing to know if you were thinking about, say, dispatching this on a social media platform, which we've now learned many social media platforms are now doing. And these are the changes in gun attitudes. So no significant effects. However, if you look at the direction and size of the effects, they grow with increasing compliance, and they're consistent with this story about people changing their attitude. So do these scores get lower? It means they move in the direction of their partner. And so that yellow line drifting to the left means the people whose own messages are being rephrased, they're becoming less committed to their previous position on gun control. So they're the AI seems to have the strongest effect on the people trying to do the persuasion rather than the people they're trying to persuade. But again, we didn't tell them to persuade, so I shouldn't use the term persuasion. We can also do all sorts of fun stuff, and I want to wrap up, but we could maybe come back. We have all sorts of natural language processing tools, so we can not only assess the intervention with survey data, but also with natural language processing tools. And yeah, that's from Perspective API. Yeah, it's a strange one. But basically, we see the same story. So good things happen when people use the intervention. But to summarize, we know that we train people before they use the tool. So if you were in the treatment condition, you got a brief training about getting the pop-up messages. So we asked people whether they remembered using it. We do a variety of manipulation checks to make sure that we think people got and understood the nature of the treatment. We find improved conversational quality, reduced divisiveness, didn't change policy views. The effects, again, are primarily on the person who they're talking to. There's this interesting puzzle about the effects on the person themselves. These also are manifest in behavioral language patterns, we think. We did do a follow-up study 8 months later, which was probably pretty optimistic to expect that any of these effects of a 15-minute conversation might have persisted over 8 months of deeply polarized American experience. They went away 8 months later. So that was sort of disappointing, but maybe we shouldn't have been surprised by that. All sorts of limitations here. So again, people didn't know AI was involved in the conversation. So lots of interesting questions about attitudes versus AI, and would that make people more likely or less likely to use it? Would it make them more likely to change their mind? Would it make them feel like like there was some kind of social engineering involved and create some kind of backfire effect? Like, we just don't know. These are one-shot conversations with strangers. So I frame this a lot about like the dinner table, right? But these are people completely random to each other. So there's probably lots of strange things going on there, right? There's no consequences on the other hand, you could argue there's no consequences of being uncivil to someone you'll never see again. So maybe you should expect more toxicity at baseline. So maybe that works in our favor, but it's also a strange sort of population to work on, because even at least on social media, like, people have some previous interaction. These are just people who we force together in this very artificial way that doesn't always happen, very rarely happens. Yeah, we have no idea what the effects of repeated exposure would be downstream. We think, however, that language models could be useful in scaling up interventions to reduce polarization in a way that can be done that respects human agency. If you want to check out the latest draft of the paper, it's on the archive, and it's called AI Chat Assistants Can Improve Conversations About Divisive Topics. And again, please do check out the work of my wonderful collaborators. Thanks for letting me share what we know. Yeah.
All right, there's time for questions. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, sure.
If you have a long question, use the AI chatbot.
Yeah.
Short questions there, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So good presentation.
Thanks. Thanks.
And one thing that I was wondering about is, so both people
Mm.
have the recommendations, right?
No, just one.
Just,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So the other person doesn't know.
Doesn't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
Hey,
I have two short questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, no, actually, only one that I'm really super interested in. So the way that I understood when you showed like the example of how it worked
Yeah.
was that ChatGPT writes basically 3 options based on those that you spoke about,
Yeah.
and then the user gets to choose one of them. My question is, was there one that was more preferred?
Well, we didn't always show them the 3 different, like, this slide's a little misleading. We showed them 3 versions of one of these 3 categories. We didn't show them 3 different interventions each time.
Okay.
So yeah, we really should have, probably should have changed that figure, because it's very confusing. And again, we haven't done the sort of heterogeneous treatment effects that one would want to do or analyses to figure out which one is maybe, if one is stronger than the other. Because of the randomization, it seems likely that all 3 have some effect, but I can't tell you which one is stronger. It's definitely a really interesting question. It's like one of my priorities in getting back to the data.
Well, sorry, can I sit?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious if you were presenting one option of each of them, if there was like a way of rephrasing it that people tend to go for.
Yeah, maybe now I'm sorry. We did this a long time ago. Now I'm misremembering. Maybe we did do 3 and no, I think we did do 3, but we varied the order. Sorry, I think I just totally I'm jet lagged or something. But I'm pretty sure we randomized the order. See, maybe you could see whether people chose, but it could also just be that people chose the first one more often than not too. I think we've done that analysis now that I'm not positive, but we haven't written it up, but I'm pretty sure we've done that analysis, and it didn't turn up anything too revelatory. Yeah.
Maybe very broadly, how do you think does this intervention resonate with the way people use social media? Do you think that they would find it enjoyable? Or do you think they engage in those types of conversations and would actually use the tool when applied to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I can tell you I can tell you there's a lot of companies exploring doing this type of thing. They tend to, if you think about the sort of more real world applications, it's probably less around building consensus and more around dissuading toxic interventions and sort of a variety of content moderation. So like a big question in the social media industry right now, I would argue, is just that they've cut back on trust and safety so much, and content moderation, made various decisions, many of the platforms, not just Twitter, to scale back content moderation. And I think because of that, there's a lot of increased interest in what can be automated. And I think there's probably a lot of naivete in how much can be automated, because, you know, for example, if our you know, model suddenly started talking about like peanut butter tacos, you know, like someone would say, what's going on? This is like a weird, like, where did that come from, right? But a AI in the wild that isn't controlled by humans, because humans are still, after all, selecting whether or not this gets shown to someone, right? There's no guardrail there, right? And even though I've become, when these models first came out, especially earlier versions like GPT-2 and Lambda, they were really wild. Like, I don't know how much, if anybody here played with it, but they could go off the rails real easy. And the fine tuning and reinforcement learning that's been done to make them more polite and civil and all those good things, I think it's gone a really long way. So I'm less concerned than I was personally years ago. And I think many of the platforms are still doing it in a way where they're trying to carefully roll it out in specific settings. But I think the problem is they're trying to apply it in conversations that have already gone off the rails. That's my concern. So like, I think it's probably most useful to enable a different kind of conversation among people who don't yet know they disagree, right? Rather than trying to de-escalate two people who are already, being social media users to each other, just being awful. And so but it's a really good question. I think the other thing is, like, you can imagine, building this, like one thing we do in our lab is build like middleware, and you might say you should build an app, and people could, like when they have an argument, like come to our app and we'll help you. And actually, which is crazy to do, but we have a text-based system, so we haven't yet rolled it out because it's still pretty buggy and not working. But essentially, you can start chatting with someone and use our system. So it's sort of like a, like you can imagine, like maybe it's a WhatsApp plugin, or maybe it's a, or maybe it's a browser plugin eventually. So you could imagine these things, but I think the issue there is just uptake, right? Like, who is going to use these things? And it's probably going to be people who are predisposed to care about toxicity on social media, which is presumably some very small part of the internet, and then there's that general problem. But, like one of the things the reason we do a lot of this middleware or like app-based extensions of our work is what we discovered is, you can get like 10,000 people, 20,000 people, maybe, like, I think the tool that's been used the most now is like 100,000 people. It's not nothing. That's a pretty good chunk of people, but it's a drop in the bucket if you're talking about like fixing social media, right? So you don't build these things to, independently as academics, like fix anything, but they're a proof of concept that a company can then say, oh, there's a prototype here. Like another example, we built a new newsfeed algorithm. It's called a bridging algorithm. And basically the idea is, instead of rewarding engagement, like posts that get a lot of likes and comments, we boost and uprank content that gets positive engagement by different types of people. So the idea is, like, instead of seeing what your side is most angry about, you see what both sides agree about. And we built this thing, and again, it was sort of Pollyannish, who's ever going to use this, and we're not going to know if he's ever going to use this. And a bunch of people used it, thanks in large part to some media coverage of it, I think. But then we didn't do anything else and thought it was going to end there. And then Twitter, before the Musk acquisition, came to us and said, we have this problem with Birdwatch, which is their crowdsourced misinformation detection program. And the problem was that the Republicans kept calling the Democrats stuff fake news, and the Democrats kept calling the Republicans posts about misinformation fake news, because the idea was that you could crowdsource misinformation detection, basically. And so what happened is, then they had the system where they would post the notes up higher if they got a lot of engagement, just like they would do with the news feed. And that just made people more polarized because it just showed the most polarizing Republican response to the most polarizing Democratic response. And it was just a disaster. But basically they're like, we saw your bridging algorithm. Can we try that with this tool? And they did. And they did a survey experiment. You can read it on the archive. I can share the paper if people are interested, but 25 to 35% drop in misinformation sharing when they displayed the posts about misinformation that both Republicans and Democrats marked as useful. So like, these are the types of things that like, that's a super important question, like, but I think as academics, we can only like at best prototype stuff, right? Like as soon as you get inside a platform, you realize like, you certainly can't force this intervention on someone, right? If I'm using Instagram and all of a sudden an annoying like paper, you guys are too young to remember the paperclip. You guys remember the paperclip? Microsoft paperclip? No?
Yeah,
God, I'm
yeah,
old.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Someone remember Cliffy. You remember Cliffy? Yeah, so it's like, it's annoying when something pops up and tell it, right? So like, and if you talk to, if you go into a company, they're like, anything that makes people stop using our product is not even, it's non-negotiable. Like it's all risk and no reward in a super competitive industry, right? Nobody will do it. So you're so constrained by these kinds of things where you can't, much as we might like to say, there should be a social media platform where everybody, speaks across social divides and use AI to make it more constructive. How do you make money with it is something that we're not really good at figuring out. Maybe we should be more, like one of the things we've started doing a lot of our research is when we do an intervention that shows there's some kind of pro-social outcome, we try to also measure things like engagement. Like if this is good for people, but makes people stop using the platform, then it's not going to work, right? So like if you think, Duncan Watts, the great sociologist, has this wonderful idea of basically science. He says you can divide science into 4 quadrants based on the usefulness of the science and the quality of the science. And so you can have science for science sake in one quadrant, and that's like Niels Bohr, if you want to use physics envy as your guide. And then you have Pasteur's quadrant, which is like high quality and high impact. And then you can have like Edison's quadrant, which is high impact but low quality science, right? And so the question I think was really interesting in this field is like, what is Pasteur's quadrant for social media research? And it's probably stuff that you have to, but maybe I'm jaded, but figuring out those business incentives is not usually on our radar. So I think you're asking a really good question, the one that I can't answer. Sorry.
Okay, I'll cut my question very short. Do
Sure.
you have any information about this 35% of people that chose not to actually rephrase their their statement? And I have a question from someone online.
Sure.
I will read quickly to you. Well, first of all, great presentation.
Thank you. Or is that the other person?
That's from, it's over for her. Could we expect different results in the perception of conversation quality now that a lot more people are aware, are users of ChatGPT?
Yeah, I think
feeling a bit difficult, perhaps.
Those are really good questions. So in the new draft of this paper, which should come out next week, we have a much better answer to this in the appendix, but we made these slides long ago, and this was the first crack of the question about who are the people who didn't or did not take up the intervention. And so these are just some really crude, I'm embarrassed to say, Excel graphs that one of our, I'm not going to take the blame on this one. This is one of our students, I hope, or maybe it was me, but I think it was one of our students. It was me. Not kidding. It was, so this is political ideology. So there doesn't seem to be a very obvious pattern, except for maybe really strong conservatives, maybe rejected the messages a little more. There doesn't seem to be a super strong education gradient, though it does seem like highly educated people were more likely to use it, which sort of speaks to the other question about maybe the more people understand the benefits, they would use it. Age was sort of interesting. It was not, I would have thought the age distribution would have gone like that, like younger people are more likely to know about AI. But again, this is all pre-ChatGPT, so I think you just can't make much of it. So yeah, no smoking gun, except maybe the extreme partisan on the conservative side, which is sort of consistent with I don't know what you guys think about the political psych research and conservatives being more resistant to engaging with, or being more resistant to being forced to do something. Is that a thing? Is there a word for that in political psych?
Maybe.
Reactance, avoidance, or something? Isn't there a word for this? Anyways,
Yeah, I
don't know.
guess, yeah, depends who you ask.
So yeah. So yeah, I don't, I can't think of any smoking gun. And for the post public, publicness of ChatGPT, yeah, I can only speculate. Like I assume it would be different, but I think the problem is in both ways, right? Like both more uptake and less uptake, because some people are really scared. In fact, when we posted this preprint to Twitter, there was a number of people who were like, I can't believe you're doing this. Like, it's so wrong to change people's minds. And we were like, we didn't like, I think either those people may have misunderstood the nature of the intervention, like that we willfully tried to change what people say, instead of understanding that we just offered them alternatives. But you can, if those types of people were taking our survey, I would suspect they would be really upset at the idea that either their arguments were trying to be transformed, or even worse, their partner had a all-powerful AI that could persuade them, and it was unfair. Right? Like you could imagine that. So I think the tricky thing with this question, which is a really good question, is there's probably like 4 or 5 different kinds of reactions that people would have according to probably largely unknowable, demographic, political factors. There's some polling on concern about AI by political persuasion in the U.S., and that story just generally it's either there doesn't seem to be much political influence, or that Democrats seem to be a little bit more concerned about bias and prejudice than conservatives in AI. But those seem to be the only. And then the other main takeaway, though, and this helps answer the question best. Almost like huge numbers of people have heard of ChatGPT as of like 3 months ago, right? It was the fastest growing consumer application ever. But still, one of the large survey research centers in the US did a survey of how many people knew about ChatGPT, and it was still only like 55%, like three months ago, which arguably isn't a lot. And then they also asked people how many have actually used ChatGPT, and then the number like plummets down to like 9%. And then they asked them like, how many people have used ChatGPT to do something useful in your life? And then the number was like 3%. So like that probably, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're doing homework. Yeah. So that would suggest that maybe it's less of a big problem, and maybe there is still this big vacuum of public, opinion about AI and that kind of thing. But I'm purely speculating right now. I really don't know.